Welcome to the Women Arise podcast. I'm Neely Hicks, and with me today is Dr. Joan Gillece. And Joan, it's so great to have you.
It's great to be here, Neely.
I want to introduce the audience to you, Joan. Joan is the director of the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, Center for Innovation in Behavioral Health Policy and Practice.
That's
a lot.
That's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful. It's going to be in the notes too of this episode. So Dr. Gillece has 40 plus years, and you're so young, Joan. You had to have started out of the birth canal. 40 plus years of experience working in the behavioral health field, specializing in systems transformation through the implementation of trauma-informed responses and the prevention of seclusion and restraint. As director of the Center for Innovation in Behavioral Health Policy and Practice, Joan oversees contracts and provides technical assistance and training, helping transform systems across various disciplines, including mental health, substance abuse, helping adult and juvenile justice and homeless services through various federal, state, local, and private contracts. Joan has a rich background, and I think some of this is going to unfold as we continue the conversation, and I'll have your full bio as part of the notes. So Joan and I met, it was January a year ago. And not this past January, but the January before, so January 2021. And I had been searching for at least 2 years, maybe more, for a model that could be used to help people through trauma, in the aftermath of trauma. And good old Google sent me to your website, and I found all of these amazing resources, and I reached out to you. And Jen, what do you remember about that first conversation?
I just remember we just clicked, and I think your work in faith communities was really resonated with me, because I think when we really understand trauma and how trauma affects us, there is that whole component of the need to be heard, the need to heal, and the need for us to understand that folks oftentimes who exhibit different kinds of mental health conditions are really in pain, and in addition to other things. And I think the role of bringing in faith communities to help in this healing is really what we've been missing. And I think it is just an incredible opportunity to have faith leaders take this on and be able to support their congregations in this healing process.
Yes. So, Joan, the term trauma is being used more mainstream these days. We hear a lot of people talking about trauma-informed resilience. What kind of life events actually fall under the category of trauma?
Well, I think we've all had traumatic experiences in our life. So what makes something traumatic is not just the event itself, but it's the individual experience of the event and the long-lasting effects. So what might be traumatic for me might not be traumatic for you. You might have had a similar trauma, and you were soothed, supported, you were able to tell someone who comforted you. Someone else might have had a similar trauma, and they were trying to tell people, and they weren't believed, they weren't heard, they weren't soothed. So then we develop ways to be able to cope with these experiences that sometimes aren't the healthiest. I mean, sometimes in order to cope with these unresolved traumatic experiences, we use drugs, we self-injure, we get in bad relationships, we don't trust, we trust too much. All of these individualized responses to that trauma. And the trauma can be not just what happens to us, It can be what we experienced. I mean, we know from individuals coming back from combat that witnessing one of their comrades be hurt is as traumatic as themselves being hurt. Witnessing a violent episode, witnessing 9/11, I mean, all of these kinds of things are traumatic experiences. And oftentimes, as Bessel van der Kolk, one of the leading psychiatrists in the world in trauma, says, the trauma lives in your body. So your mind might forget, your mind might process it different, but it comes imprinted, and that the trauma lives in your body. So again, it can be witnessing violence, experiencing violence, abandonment, neglect, poverty, racism. All of these things are traumatic events in our lives that deeply affect us. And one of the other reasons I love this in faith communities is oftentimes when people have serious trauma, people do things to cope, use drugs, heroin, for example. We can look at what's going on, with heroin epidemic. Oftentimes people do things in the throes of that addiction that they're not proud of. They're oftentimes shamed by just the stigma of addiction, or shamed by what they did. And so I feel like in faith communities, whether as we've been working with, Muslim and Jewish and Christian and even Native American, whatever, the concept of not just healing, but also forgiveness is something that is so unique to this new initiative and so extremely important to the work. Because if you can't feel forgiven, if you can't forgive yourself, it's almost impossible to start that healing process, because you keep reenacting and feeling that shame over and over again.
Yes, that's what we do. We replay it over and over in our minds, and then we think, well, if I had done this differently, would I have had a different outcome? I shouldn't have been there at that time. I shouldn't have been nice to this person. If I had been more, I don't know, staunch in my reaction, I would have gotten a different outcome. I should have fought. All of those things. And it really takes us down that rabbit hole, which feels like a rabbit hole, but but anyway, to just spiral and then get stuck and then not be able to live in the present moment. You said something about how the body remembers the trauma, and I want to go into that a little bit more for our listeners, because this is fairly new to people. I think most people are still believing that, oh, I just need to get my mind on something else so I don't feel bad. What can you tell us more about how the body really does keep the score?
Yeah, I think you can look at what happens when we have these unresolved traumas. What happens, just say, for example, you're a kid and you hear domestic violence in your home, or you hear mom get beaten, or you hear gunshots outside of the room, or whatever it might be. And sometimes, one child in the house might sleep through it. One child in the house might stay up all night and is petrified, and the next day goes to school and can't sit still, and then gets labeled ADHD or whatever happens. You have another kid who really blocks off that conscious memory of what happened. You become dissociative. You really just block off that conscious memory. It's why some people have periods of time of childhood or in adulthood that they don't remember, because you really take yourself out of that situation. And so, but it has to go somewhere, right? And so that trauma that lives in your body might come out as hyperarousal. You're always, agitated. You're afraid of something is going to happen next. You might have extreme anxiety, depression. Lots of these different things there's meaning behind that. There's meaning behind it. And how do we get to understanding that meaning? I mean, right now we're good at medicating our way through it, or, and it's not that medicine is bad and medicine is good. Absolutely. But really what you're doing is you're taking care of the symptom and not the cause. So a lot of things that we do now that are different, because oftentimes we don't have the words to describe If trauma happened pre-verbal, you don't have the words. If you were dissociative, you don't have the words. I mean, there's lots of reasons that people might not have the words. So we do a lot of sensory work. Occupational therapists are amazing in this work to be able to understand sensory modulation and to look at some alternatives. If you hear, you can Google about tapping, tapping into your what it points in your body that are soothing. You're going to hear mindfulness, yoga, different kind of breathing strategies that really help people take it down a notch when they start to get ramped up, that are oftentimes traumatic responses. I mean, you can really realize when, if something happens and you get triggered or you get anxious, your palms might sweat, your heart might race, you might have trouble breathing, all sorts of things can happen. So you do have that really physical response to things that are happening emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes you do just feel it like in your body, in your chest, or
Yeah.
I can feel things in the pit of my stomach.
Yeah.
When something bad happens, I start getting that pain in my gut.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, worst case scenario, it goes into like sweat down my back. At times I've fainted. At times I have, because I wasn't breathing. I
Right.
wasn't practicing. I didn't know to do the abdominal breathing.
Right, right, exactly. And what we're trying to do in different programs, we have a program called Tamar, named after Tamar in the Old Testament, who was a trauma survivor. But the acronym is Trauma, Addiction, Mental Health, and Recovery. As we're doing that with you, Neely, in faith communities, we've been doing it for 20 some years in criminal justice and mental health and substance use. And so it's really what we call psychoeducational, and that means it's not per se therapy per se. It's so you don't have to be a analyst or a clinician to listen to what happened to people and being able to help them through that. It explains to folks why they might be feeling the way that they do. This is how trauma affects us. This is how you might be feeling. And after each session, people learn what we call self-regulation strategy. People learn how to do those things that you were talking about, the deep breathing, the mindfulness, etc. So we first educate them on where this comes from, and then we provide them with some solutions that they can do easily. And the beauty of this work, I think, is that it's free. I mean,
Yes.
it doesn't cost any money. It's really open to people being able to customize the Tamar program to meet their own needs. We've recently added a module on smoking. We had folks that are very involved in smoking cessation, and we know that oftentimes people who have distress, smoking is soothing for them, right? So we even have put that into our modules to be able to help people find alternatives to smoking when they start to feel stressed. So, that's really what it's about.
Yeah. And so these are really life skills. They're things that help us do life better.
Yeah.
And I love that about Tamar. I want to step back and ask you about how Tamar got started.
Well, how Tamar got started, it was, oh gosh, 20 plus, almost 25 years ago. We were working and we had a grant from SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health and Services Administration. We had a grant from them to do a project on jail diversion. And we chose to look at developing parity between women and males who are incarcerated, because back then, the women didn't have as many services as the men did. So we wanted to do some work on how can we develop better mental health programming, better substance use programming, better services for women and children. So part of the evaluation of this first grant was to talk to the women and see what a difference it made when we were providing these supports. And we did a whole evaluation. And one of the questions we just happened to ask was on abuse. I mean, we really weren't looking for it then. And back then we found over 85% of the women who were incarcerated that we talked to had physical, sexual, emotional abuse in their past. And that led us to say, we need to do something about this. This isn't what we were looking for. This is what we found. So we wrote another grant to SAMHSA, and we were funded in the Women in Violence project to be able to, now that we know the prevalence of trauma, what can we do about it? So we started out in 3 detention facilities in Maryland. Now it's all over the place. But what we did was we developed a intervention that could be done easily in the prisons that would, again, explain what it was, how trauma affected us, and then be able to support it. We came up with the name. We already had the intervention done. We knew exactly what we wanted to do. It was all manualized, but we didn't have a name for it. So one of my colleagues, we're in the middle of writing this grant, said, "Oh my gosh, I thought of a name." This was on a Monday. She said, "I was in church yesterday and the sermon was about Tamar and about her experience with her half brother, Absalom, I guess, in the Old Testament." And she said, "I thought we're doing this for the Tamars of today because we were doing it for women in 3 detention centers. And then just by chance, the acronym was trauma, addiction, mental health, and recovery." So that's how it all came into being. And since that time, we have been treating men and been in multiple settings, going on in all the settings you talked about earlier, Neely, and substance abuse, obviously in inpatient mental health and community services, because it's manualized, so the clinician or the people that are running the groups, the faith-based organizations, know exactly how to run each groups. There's worksheets for everybody in taking the sessions, and then at the end of each session, you learn one of those self-regulation strategies. So that's what started, and we're still going strong. And I think one of the reasons it is going strong is because we are very open to people adapting it. I mean, we don't say you must have fidelity to our model or anything. We're very into use this, edit it, delete, add, do whatever makes sense for the folks that you're serving.
Yes.
So it's very flexible.
Honestly, this is something that could be used as an individual. Like you can read this and you can go through the self-regulation. You can read about trauma in the Tamar curriculum. You can also do it in a household, which would be great to be able to open up this kind of dialogue within your family members and do self-regulation with one another, in the presence of one another. So you have a level of accountability. And when someone starts to get too anxious, being reminded, okay, let's take a pause. Let's do some deep breathing together. I think that could be incredibly helpful. We're seeing it in Memphis. The leaders of St. Matthew's United Methodist Church, one of them has just been trained, and they're looking at using it among their program with people who are homeless, who are without housing in the Memphis community. As they come and stay at the church, they're going to be able to learn these things. And so it really does give that kind of, basis from which people who are already in community with one another, who are doing life together, can have this as a way to connect with themselves and with each other.
And that's what happens when we first started doing this in the prisons and in the detention centers. Would hear, "Oh, nobody's ever going to keep this confidential. Everybody's going to tell everybody else's business." That's not what happens. What happens is organically they become peer supporters to one another. There is that understanding. We've all been through these extremely painful experiences, and you find that empathy grows and people really support one another outside of the session. We've done all sorts of things with it. We during the pandemic in one correctional facility, they were able to get tablets, like little iPad-y things, for incarcerated individuals who had to be locked in way too many hours during the pandemic. And we put it on that tablet. We loaded it
Oh,
on so people could follow along and be able to try some of those strategies. We developed one for youth.
hmm.
With the help of youth, it was pilot tested, and we got advice from the kids and developed for youth, that we did in juvenile services. And now, nearly, under your leadership, we're doing it in faith-based organizations.
Mhm. And we'll be coming out soon with the youth version of
Hmm.
Tamar. And so we'll have that. Be sure to go to TriumphOverTrauma.info to download this free resource bundle. And if you want to become a facilitator, the training is for free as well. Joan, we met recently about the word compassion. And I'd like to close out this episode talking a bit about empathy and compassion and the value of those two things in community today.
Yeah, we had some funding from a wonderful organization called Sozoze, and we were able to bring together very diverse individuals. We had police, we had people who had received services, we had folks who were providing services, we had folks within LGBTQ community, we had administrators, we had faith leaders, we had community organizers. We gathered at the American Visionary Museum in Baltimore. They happened to be having a show called Compassion and Healing, parentheses, or the lack thereof. We gathered about 30 people together at the museum. The incredible director, Rebecca Hofberger, took us through the show. That is, the Visionary Museum is a place for artists who are untrained artists who do their work in order to be able to heal and to be able to work things through, obviously, that they have experienced themselves. So it's, some people call it folk art, some people call it outsider art, some people call it art brut, but it's really art from individuals who are using the art in order of self-expression and who are not trained artists. So we went through the show, then we had a meeting for everyone to be able to talk about what does compassion mean to them. And what was fascinating is it was the common thread that brought us all together. You have very diverse groups, and you might have the clinical people thinking the police don't get it, or the police thinking that the clinical people don't get it, or people receiving services thinking neither one of them gets it, right? But what we found was when we focused on something like compassion, it was a great unifier because everyone really talked about compassion in a very similar way. And we thought if we can tap into this kind of communal, the commonness of us all really going into this work for the most part, because we did have that compassion. Sometimes we lose sight of it for all many different reasons. But if we could all start at that point, we were more alike than we were different.
Mm.
And we have nearly, I'm thinking as we're talking, we could put the up on this website on Triumph over Trauma. We can put it up there. We have videos of people who have been in Tamar talking about what a difference it's made in their lives, incarcerated individuals. So we can really share that, right, and link
Yes.
to, so people can have all sorts of different resources that they can look at it and learn from.
That would be great. Yeah, I think the commonness of us all is a powerful phrase. And I think when we do get back to this basic human fact that all of us walking upon the face of this earth have experienced trauma in some form. And if we can recognize one another in one another, that we are the same, I think it can help us overcome other barriers and divisions and help us find more compassion for one another.
Yeah, and if I could
Anything?
add, in addition
Yeah.
to that, we just finished something working with Native American community in terms of enhancing services for people who are in crisis. So we worked with folks from tribal communities to figure out what can we do differently, what would be of service. And it was a really incredibly profound year experience working with folks, because we found such the importance of making relatives. So we have a workbook, and we can give you this link too, Neely,
Yes.
called Making Relatives. And it's how do we engage folks in the tribal communities on reservations to become those helpers and to become that relative. So we did that, and then we developed a few videos to go along with it. And it's really about healing soul wounds. And that's what we really focused on. How do we heal these wounds of the soul? And I think that's really where it's at. And I think if we can expand the supports for people that are in pain, because it isn't just mental health, it's a lot of things that have contributed to the mental health of individuals in a negative way, that if we can heal and bring that back together through providing these supports in community and making those relatives, we can really make a big difference. Because mental health important, and going to a therapist important, but the rest of the time, how do we even provide additional supports for individuals in community that are strength-based and healing?
Yes, because it's a daily practice.
It is. It
It
is. And how do
really
we
is.
include people in pain, and people who have had psychiatric diagnosis are often disconnected from things in community that would help them heal. I have many folks who said they're not feeling comfortable in church because they've been on the streets all night, or they don't have the right clothes, or whatever the situation might be. You have kids that have mental health diagnoses that you don't see going to the centers for ballet class or soccer teams. You know, how do we in community understand that these symptoms are frequently adaptations to people's pain, and the best we can do as community and as understanding we're all more alike than we're different, work together to make sure that even those that might appear different, how can we include them and embrace them, those that are most.
Yes. Yes, that's really important. And I mean, it's a sad thing to me that the church has become a place where, oh, you've got to dress up to go there, or you
Yeah.
won't fit in. Or because ultimately, I look at the church as a form of a hospital. Like, we all go there knowing that we're sick, like something's not right with humanity, with the world, with whatever, but we join in this great hope that God is with us and that all shall be well. And eventually, and that even in this moment, we can find at least a semblance of peace. So, and comfort one another, meet each other in compassion and empathy, and comfort one another.
You bring up a really good point, Neely, and that is oftentimes people who have really suffered, ongoing, long, unhealed traumas have a very difficult time in believing in any higher power, or believing or using faith in order to be able to help them heal, because they feel like, how can there be anybody that's watching over me if this has been allowed to happen to me time and time and time again? I mean, it's another reason that I'm just so, I feel like I've come full circle from naming it Tamar, from the sermon, to now seeing faith communities running Tamar groups in their churches, mosques, synagogues, is pretty incredible, because it's tapping into yet another place of healing for the individual in pain.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. Well, Joan, I want to thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. And I want to put out another plug for TriumphOverTrauma.info. That's where you'll find all of the resources. You'll be able to sign up for online training if you want to become a facilitator. And as we get more people trained as facilitators, we'll be able to also connect you with online groups for you to join until physical groups are near you. I want to also tell you that you can text the word hope to 615-933-5387. That's 615-933-5387. Just text the word hope to that number, and you'll start receiving a daily reminder that you are not alone. And I hope that that'll be a blessing to you. Joan, thank you again.
Yeah.